Good afternoon. I'm Esther De Leon, Associate Librarian for the University Libraries. I welcome to the Library's Hispanic Heritage Month event, Midday Pláticas, Cultural Heritage Awareness. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the lands on which we gather, Texas Tech, Lubbock, and the surrounding region, are occupied and ceded territory of the Comanche, Mescalero, Apache peoples. We acknowledge that Texas Tech University owes its existence and success to the generations from across the globe who gave their hopes, dreams, and energy in guiding us to this moment in history. Some were brought here against their will, others left their distant homes in hope of a better future, and some have lived on this land since time immemorial. Texas Tech resides today on the ancestral lands of the Comanche, Mescalero, Apache peoples, the original stewards of what is now Lubbock and was once the heart of the Comanche area. The foundation of our institution came at a direct cost of the indigenous peoples whose land and labor this university was built upon. As we gather, we acknowledge these truths is crucial for building and fostering mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Miguel Levario and Dr. Aaron Sánchez. Dr. Miguel Levario, Associate Professor of History, specializing in U.S. History, Borderland Studies, Chicana, OX, Mexican American History. Dr. Levario received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in United States History with a specialization in Borderlands History. He is the author of Militarizing the Border When Mexicans Became the Enemy. Dr. Aaron E. Sánchez, Assistant Professor of History, specializing in U.S. Southwest Chicana, OX History, U.S. Intellectual Cultural History. Dr. Sánchez received his PhD from Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He is the author of Homeland Ethnic Mexican Belonging since 1900s.
Well, thank you. Appreciate everyone joining us, Dr. Sánchez and I, for this Plática. We wanted to keep this as casual and relatively informal as possible, just to kind of have a conversation about ethnic studies, and particularly Mexican American Latino studies. And I don't know, Dr. Sánchez, is there anything you want to start us off with? Or
no, thank you all for coming, taking time out of your day. I know everybody gets busy, so yeah, super excited to chat with you all. I thought we were thinking about maybe just starting off with, like how we get into the field, why you should take these Mexican American Latino studies courses. And so I think we aren't from the same place, but we share a similar background, the El Paso, Juarez area. And so when Miguel and I were discussing this, I mentioned that of all my family, my mom's from a family of 9, my dad's from a family of 6. And so lots of cousins, I think 24 on one side and 16 or 18 on the other. A lot. And of all of those, when they went off to college, I could convince only one of them to take a course in Mexican American Studies. And I didn't grow up around the El Paso, Juarez area. I went there for summer vacations. My dad was in the Air Force. I was an Air Force brat, so I grew up in like Rose Hill and Abilene, Texas. More folks around here know where Abilene is than most. And so, yeah, I didn't grow up in those areas, but we visited quite a bit. So when I got to college, I think the people from El Paso just were like, we already know it because we grew up there, and there's a sense that maybe they don't. And then for me, I didn't even know. I accidentally got into one of these courses my first year because I didn't actually think I didn't plan on graduating. I was going to be a musician. Actually, my hair was long and red, and I was going to go to Austin.
News to me.
I was in San Antonio, and I was going to go up to Austin after a semester. But I had a bad registration time, and my sister told me, take a class with this professor. He's really nice. Tell him you're my brother, and he'll let you, pink slip into it or get in. And that's how I got hooked. We started reading David Montejano's Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas, and I had just never heard any of it. And I remember waiting till everybody filed out. That was my first year. I had never talked to a professor really, and I came up with the book, and I said, "Is this true?" Like almost in a whisper. I didn't know. And after that, I got hooked. There was so much that I didn't know as far as the institutions and the ideas and the core beliefs of this nation, how Latinas and Latinos, ethnic Mexicans, how they contributed to some of those, but also
I think how these ideas and institutions and beliefs were also shaped by these communities. So it wasn't just that we were part of them, but we were also central in making or making positive changes, but also trying to push back on those unfortunate institutions and histories that we have.
Yeah, for me, as Dr. Sanchez had alluded to, it was more of taking it for granted. You know, growing up in El Paso, being surrounded by, it's 85% of Latinos with 98% of those of Mexican descent. So the idea of speaking Spanish or hearing Spanish or English and all that and interchanging the two, is not something you think about until you move to South Bend, Indiana, and you realize, oh, that's not the way the rest of the world is. I remember I was going to a wedding there, and we were driving out to Fort Wayne, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and you see these fields of grain, and my first instinct was, wow, I'm in America. I was born and raised in El Paso in the United States, and I was like, I'm in America, wow, fields of grain and stuff like that. But no, it wasn't for my experiences with the Center for Mexican American Studies at Stanford and the University of Texas kind of reminded me. Actually, I'll take a little bit back real quick. I took a class. I'm a bit of an academic transient. I started my academic career at University of New Mexico because my parents wanted me to be a pharmacist. That didn't work out, and I'm glad I wasn't, because I can barely pronounce ibuprofen. And so when I was there, my sophomore year, I took a class called Mexican Culture, and it was by this professor by the name of Enrique Lamadrid. And that changed my life. I mean, we had to do field work in Chihuahua, and he spent our spring break going in reverse of the Mexican Revolution in some ways, going in through Columbus, New Mexico, and Palomas, where Pancho Villa had invaded and so forth, and then heading down to the Sierra Madres and the Copper Canyon and that area, and coming back through Juarez. And it was interesting because I had lunch with my mom coming from Juarez to meet her in El Paso, which would have been the other way around in some ways, right? To visit family in Juarez or whatever. And it just kind of like seeing that dynamic and learning our history. And I was like, wow, I wasn't aware that I needed to go to Albuquerque to learn about the history of El Paso or history about where I was living. And so that kind of spearheaded me. I switched my major from pharmacy to English and Spanish. And then I said, well, I better go join my brothers at South Bend and Notre Dame. And that's how I ended up there. But it was the Mexican American Studies program that really kind of integrated me into the university system, right? And especially as a graduate student, being one of few Latinos in those graduate programs, and that it was about feeling like having a sense of belonging there, right? It was a space where I could go and hear things that were familiar, see things that were familiar, but also be welcomed. And not to say that these universities were hostile. By no means were they hostile, but it was nice to have that space for me. And again, at the University of Texas, that's where they did more than just welcome me, but I was able to get my first. Actually, at Stanford, to get my first experience that probably would not have been afforded to me, or I would have been a part of a longer list of people to get funding, experience, and what have you. And if it wasn't for CMAS, I probably wouldn't have had that. So so it's something that I really am grateful for from a personal standpoint, but it's also what's motivating me since in my professional trajectory, to try to see if we can build something here that is similar to that with my colleague here, Sarah. We've been trying to do that in building the Latino Studies programs here.
Yeah, that's a good point that Miguel said. That these courses, it's a process of discovery, but also our bigger connection. So, just in my own research, there's this Chicano's journal, like literary journal, called Caracol, printed out of San Antonio, and I think we have copies of it here in the stacks too. But in the first episode they explain, or in the first issue, not episode, they explain why Caracol, and it was a metaphor. And part of it was if you're already politicized, you follow the course of this shell inwards. to kind of self-discovery. If you already have that sense of yourself, you follow it outwards to politicization and connection to community and activism. And I think that the field of studies still does that in a really important way. It's not just trying to like learn these abstract facts and dates and then just go away. It's you're learning about yourself and your connection to various communities. Certainly initially with maybe the ethnic Mexican community or these other Latino communities, but eventually communities outside of that. And so, yeah, the forms of analysis, the fields of studies do that really well, which I think is one of the strengths and one of the reasons why I was so excited about it as an undergrad and kept studying it through graduate school.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the, I consider one of the core principles of ethnic studies, in particular Mexican American studies, is that it has an obligation and a responsibility to serve the community. It's one of the things that I appreciate about that is that it's not necessarily isolated within this ivory tower of academia, but it's almost obligated to serve its community. And one of the examples I give what that means is that I had the fortune of being trained by a scholar by the name of Emilio Zamora, who emphasized that, and he practices that. He is constantly, whether he's advocating in the Texas legislature or if he's building curricula in our K through 12 program to install Mexican American studies in Texas schools. He demonstrated that, and he says, Miguel, when you get out there, make sure that what you produce can also be available to the community. So, we have to satisfy, our requirements as scholars, tenure and all that good stuff. But he said, even with that, you should make it, and that's make it accessible to the community, that's useful to the community. And not only in your work, but your presence there, right? And that's one thing that always kind of stayed with me and still to this day stays with me, in that we have that public service or that community service that's a core principle of ethnic studies or Mexican American studies, on top of course, of teaching and research, of course, right? One of the other benefits of when we have Mexican American studies is that we are allowing our students to see people who maybe look like them, who maybe have similar backgrounds, And I will never forget, and this almost happens almost every semester, but I was teaching a Texas history class last spring of 400 students, and I had one student come up to me and say, I just want to say it's so wonderful to see a Mexicano or Chicano up here teaching this class. And it gives me goosebumps, and it's like, I was just there. But it means so much, right? And in the teaching, and then being and thinking about inclusivity. So I'm teaching Texas history. They're going to learn about Tejanos as well. They're going to learn about El Paso, which is like the 5th largest city, and nobody even knows it's even part of Texas. I understand why, because we're in a different time zone. And it's closer for us to go to the beach in California than it is in Texas. But other than that, there's these aspects of it that they feel included. So, and he said, I never really go to my classes, but I don't want to miss this one because you actually talk about my hometown or you talk about our area, our region. So it's those kinds of representation, I think, is another core element that it allows for our students to at least identify pretty quickly and pretty superficially, oh, that's an interesting class. It's something I understand, and meet maybe a faculty member that looks like me and all that.
Yeah, that connection and that discovery was why I even finished as an undergrad. I mean, without that class, I would be a broke musician. I would have faded by there. But yeah, I understand that importance then for me as a student. And exactly, we still have those experiences where we get to see that in students. And it's so powerful for both us and students, I think.
And yeah, we look back on the history, of ethnic studies in universities, right? They really have their foundation in the Chicano movement, the civil rights movement of African Americans and so forth. And we can see that, and I tell these students, it's like, when we look at those movements, we have to think about their greater impact, right? One is, of course, that you can study history about you, but you can also understand that the bigger structure, whether it's government or institutions, having to accommodate or having to acknowledge, not accommodate, but acknowledge you, right? We look at free, school lunches. The Black Panther Party was very much active in providing food to their neediest children in Oakland. The Brown Berets were doing the same thing in South Texas, right? So we have these sort of examples of how you can bridge this activism or this scholarship, but also make it to where you're contributing to your surrounding community. And but it's also about self-awareness, right? I mean, that's part of, Dr. Sánchez reminded me of the Plan de Santa Bárbara, right? The one of the quintessential early documents that essentially made the statement of what Mexican American studies was about, right? And what it should be about. And you're talking about, I wrote a snippet here because I wanted to share it with everybody. It's a radical proposal that combined education, research, and political consciousness with the objective to empower and break open a pathway towards higher education for generations to come. And I thought that was just a nice way of synthesizing in a way of like why the Mexican American studies or Latino studies or African American studies all matter, women's studies matter, right? Because that's what they intend to do and they often achieve it.
I think that's also why you still need something like Mexican American Latino Studies, even in a place like Tech that's now becoming an HSI, right? You're like, well, we've got a bunch, why do we need these classes? It's connected to all that stuff, but it's also connected to that idea that the university also isn't just an abstract thing on its own. It's the people and its mission. And so, HSIs kind of develop differently. I would, again, they're almost an accident of demographics. Very rarely are these HSIs saying, we have this community that we're committed to and that we want to engage with and lay these things out. That certainly there were a range of Latinas and Latinos in different institutions of higher education throughout the early 20th century, or I believe in the late 19th century. But their presence there, in many cases, they were there maybe because they were privileged or lighter skinned, but I also think in the university they couldn't necessarily study themselves. The university was interested in those communities primarily as like explaining either them as racially inferior or culturally deficient subjects in much of the 20th century. So these communities, if you go to places like USC or UC, we look at it, they're maybe studying the Mexican problem in the early field of social work. Through the 40s and 50s, the field of education, public education, is also still seeing them as this Mexican problem. How do we fix it? And so they're seen either as racially inferior, culturally deficient subjects. It's with the civil rights movement, especially the Chicana and Chicano movement of the 60s, which the Plan de Santa Bárbara in 1969 was an attempt to transform the university, right? So that it's not this distant institution of power, but they wanted to use the power of the university, its ability to create knowledge, to accumulate research, to give social legitimacy. They wanted to use that power of the university to empower the community. And so they needed to use the university to create the knowledge that the community. So they're not just subjects anymore, but they're active participants. They're creating, they're the scholars, the researchers, answering the issues that the community's facing, and then distributing it, disseminating it, making sure it gets out there. So that, academics weren't in this rethinking of what the university could be in the Chicano movement, not like these ivory tower intellectuals, but scholars committed to these communities.
Yeah, like, so there's certain terms that we can attribute to that, right? Citizen scholars, scholar activists, these kinds of terms that we can use. And I'm thinking of, when this push happened to bring, Mexican American studies to the university, one of the pioneering activists during that time was interviewed in San Antonio, I believe it was, and he mentioned like one of our biggest mistake was that we didn't start with the elementary schools, but fortunately, we have people who have taken up that baton, right? We have the more well-known program at Tucson, right? Until it was dismantled in 2010 because of racism, quite frankly. It was a very successful program. They were able to provide data proving that the kids were staying in school, absenteeism went down, graduation rates went significantly higher when they introduced Mexican American studies in those school systems. And now Texas, and we have several scholars, including myself and Dr. Zamora and Dr. Carmona out at UTRGV. Actually, he just changed to a different university. I forgot which one it was. But anyhow, they're all collectively trying to, advocate at the Texas legislature to introduce a K through 12 mass program, mass curriculum. And on top of that, to include it as part of the text or the standardized testing at Texas, in Texas, right? So it's not just this elective that you take, but it's actually part of the core curriculum. So it's about inclusivity, right? Because with inclusivity, then everything kind of falls in many ways, right? You have the acknowledgement of diverse voices, you have the acknowledgement of inequalities, but also the search for equality. So we include those voices and include those certain experiences. It allows us to move even that much further, and when it comes to education. And as we know, when we teach, especially when we talk about Brown v. Board of Education or Hernandez versus Texas, but more Brown v. Board, one of the principal arguments on why the elementary schools and the African American Civil Rights Organization said, without education, nothing else is possible. So that's why it became a priority, and you can see that also with the Chicano movement and other Latino movements that were happening around the same time. And I think that's where the HSI comes into play, right? And I think that those of us who are familiar with HSI, the operative word is serving. And it's also the most challenging word, right? How do we serve? How do we effectively serve our students? And one way is through curriculum, right? One way is through our Latino studies programs that we're developing, having a presence, right? But it's serving this, and I think one way that we have the foundation and the template to do that is that we can look at ethnic studies. As I mentioned before, right? The connection to community service and public service allows us to serve as a model, to have a model here when we look at how can we better serve our Latino students at the university.
Yeah, with all those things that Miguel said, right? Without those, it's certainly not serving, right? Like the better term would be Hispanic enrolling. That's
Yeah.
And at that point, then again, that's just okay. That's all it is. But to make it a Hispanic serving institution, they can take those models out of the discipline and show those connections, which again benefit lots of folks. I know in my courses, the kinds of assignments that I use reflect that kind of engagement. So I ask my students to go out and do kind of oral histories of their own family histories and ask them. And it's because I tell them, generally the archive doesn't necessarily capture regular people very effectively, but that doesn't mean that they don't matter. And so I had to do this with my own family history, with my grandparents and great-grandparents, and capture that and be able to place it into that history. Now they can go out and ask, at that point in my classes, it's not just Latinos or Latinas, it's everybody enrolled there, and they're going out and discovering those histories, their family histories, and understanding how they're connected to these major historical events or processes on their own. And so it certainly is something that I learned coming out of the field of Chicana and Chicano studies, but now influences just my general teaching of U.S. history.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because it does, the Family History Project is one I use as well. And I find it one of my more rewarding assignments, because a couple of things, right? I mean, it's them understanding, what I tell them is like the objective here is to find your place and your voice within history. And almost every single time, they have a deeper and clearer knowledge and understanding of their own self, but also of their own families. I mean, I can't tell you how many times these students talk about, like, I didn't know this about my mom, or I didn't know that why we did this all the time. Basic, like very core elements like that ethnic studies allows our students to have even a bigger sense of belonging. On top of that, we're able to allow them to see how, as Dr. Sánchez mentioned earlier, that it's not just about including, and then here's the Mexican part of that. No, it's about looking at history and saying, you had a role in building that. Your ancestors, even your uncles or your aunts and whatever, had a role in building that, whether it's participating in our numerous conflicts historically, or whether it's building bridges, infrastructure. They get that connection, and I think it allows us to sort of expand their horizons and understanding, at least to have a deeper appreciation of whether it's where they come from, their family comes from, but I think it's also that they just have another a growth moment in self-realization, in their own self-identity, as they're exploring that in university, right? I mean, that's one of the things we see here at university. They're experimenting, they're exploring, and this allows them to sort of like, if they either took it for granted like I did because I'm surrounded by it, or they grew up in an area where they're the minority, they can have this situation too, where they can have belonging, but also see themselves have agency, have power, whether through their family histories or themselves in the broader narrative. And I think that's one of the numerous, I think we're going on numerous benefits of ethnic studies, in particular Mexican American Latino studies. I don't know, do we want to open it up for questions at this time? I don't want to.
Comment earlier about how that got a book show, in from out. Mine's more like rural.
It's a connect the dots.
And I've also made a comment to you guys before that sometimes students don't know that they need to know, that they even want to know what they don't know. Because I know I didn't know that I wanted to know the things that I know now. What are ways do you think we can better engage with, one, all students, but two, specifically those of Latinx or heritage? Like what? Because I know I've met some recently. They're like, I'm just here.
Yeah.
I don't care about my history, or maybe they don't know that they want to know these things. Because I, as a student later on in life, and I'm learning these things, and I'm learning these concepts, and I'm learning these different things that I should have known. I wish I would have known back then. Nobody told me I could have learned this stuff. What are ways that we should do that?
I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. I stumbled into my first ethnic studies class because I had a crush on a girl that was taking the class. And never ended up dating her, so it didn't work out. But all serious aside, I think that's the $1 million question, because it's so varied in where these students are coming from, right? And I would invite Dr. Sylvia to talk about this, because she deals with this whole issue. How do we promote our programs so that students can feel, can want to take them, right? Because I'm struggling with that. We're trying to fill our classes. And one thing that we're trying to do is, Sylvia just introduced to me, is like, social media. But I think on another level, what I'm trying to do, because of what I remember back as an undergraduate, what meant the most to me were personal contacts. And this kind of goes to one of the lessons I learned when I ran for public office, is like, you're not going to do anything, make any advancement, unless you're in front of people, knocking on doors, or getting yourself in front of people. And I think these same concepts can be applied to here. So as much as we possibly can, put ourselves physically in front of our students, so that at the very least they can say, oh, wow, there's a guy from El Paso, there's a guy from Dallas or Abilene that's, where I'm from, and I'd be interested, or maybe curious at least, right? I think that's one way, but I think that's the $1 million question, because you're right, they're gonna be like, whatever, man, I'm from El Paso, I already know this stuff, right? They don't realize that they really don't, like I didn't, right? But I don't know.
Yeah, I think both our experiences, how we kind of stumbled into it, reflect that it's very few of us know it from the get-go. It's not like I got to college, I was a first-generation college student. I thought you went to be a doctor or a lawyer, that's why I was going to drop out and be a musician. And so it is almost by accident, because we don't know those fields exist. I think it hints at some more institutionally why I ended up in the class I did, was because it did count for a piece of that common curriculum or your intercultural awareness credit. So, that class was available. My sister had taken it, told me it's a great class, go into it. And so that's how I kind of, by accident, went into it. And so I think institutionally those are important things, making sure these classes count for something other than a minor major, and that gets students in there, and then we hook them. That's how we get.
And that's what we did with the mass minor, is that, as we were trying to figure out how can we get more students, is that we actually included it in the arts and sciences multicultural core curriculum. So you don't have to necessarily minor in it to take that class, and you kind of kill two birds with one stone, or maybe three birds with one stone. Either you satisfy your requirement, you maybe satisfy a curiosity you have, or maybe you have parents or relatives who are saying, you gotta take something like that so you can learn, So that was one way we did, and it did help us improve our enrollment. Again, we're still struggling, but I think it's just a matter of exposure, and I hope to improve on that in the near future once we have things more stabilized, right?
About your family, that you can also take them to the Southwest Collection.
Yes.
They're very handy when you have family reunions, and it's like you don't, like you said, you learn certain things that you didn't realize or you took for granted.
Yeah, right.
But I was just going to add that.
That's a good point.
It's extremely beneficial.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that even more as I've gotten older. Because I've actually started writing down my own, and being an offspring of first gen, I realized the significance of it.
Oh, excellent. That's a good point.
We actually have an exhibit next door at the archives.
Oh, the brown and black in print?
Yeah, and then one of my uncles who used to run one of the local newspapers is highlighted in there. But she made a point, like, if we don't archive or do these things and learn about the families, which I really like that y'all do, you lose that. And it's kind of sad.
That's one of the things that we wanted to emphasize when at least I'm going to speak for myself, I'm not going to speak for Dr. Sánchez, but when I assigned that project, it's reflective of what is very common within Latino communities, is storytelling, right? Because of language or maybe because of education level, but regardless, you have storytelling. Like we all have those examples of, all of a sudden your abuela is just like talking to you, and you're just like, whoa, I thought we were watching the soccer game, but then now we're talking about, when you crossed and all this other stuff, right? And it's all about storytelling. She's not gonna write it down. She's not gonna formalize it, but it's those moments. And so when these students have to engage, they're kind of like, oh, it's something that's natural, because they realize they've tried other ways to communicate with their relatives, but they just say, can you just talk to me and tell me a story? And it just kind of comes out. They're just like amazed by it, right? But I think it's that oral history aspect of it, the storytelling aspect that we try to also pay respect to, but also, it's also useful, right? And I think it goes to the cultural competencies. That's one last thing. One of the things I want to mention too is one of the things that we teach our students, because they're all saying like, well, I'm not in arts and sciences, I'm not in liberal arts or whatever. It's like, that's not the point. I can't tell you how many times my wife comes home, she's a nurse at UMC, and she's just like, if it wasn't for me being ingrained in your family, I wouldn't know what they meant by this. I wouldn't even know how to communicate with them, and even in broken Spanish. But she knew some of the cultural nuances. Even to something light, like she got a joke, and even the lady's like, ¿me entendiste? Like, esta güera, this white girl, and she's like, yeah, my in-laws say that all the time, or whatever, right? Or my husband, and but it was like those little nuances that matter, right? And she's not in liberal arts; her BA is in biology and so forth. But it's like those are translatable. If that's a correct term, transferable skills that we also provide for our students. So that's how we try to attract them, right? It's like, just because you're in engineering or you're in the hard sciences or the natural sciences doesn't mean you're not going to gain a skill set here that you're going to use in your later career. And and I think if emphasizing that will hopefully yield more enrollment in our classes. I don't know, Silvia, do you have anything to add about that? Because I know you're in the same boat about.
What really the students are all wanting to do is connect with their family again, and what they're wanting to do is speak. And so at the end of the semester, I'm
Any other or comments? Yes, Amir.
So I've been thinking about the value of education and self-discovery, but I really wanted to hear more about the service learning or the community component, specifically of courses that we offer here. What are the activities and projects they're doing in the communities? Are they trying to capture more of oral history? Are they engaging, with organizations?
So that's a very good question. And I was, since we're a relatively brand new minor, we haven't had students reach, but service learning is a required course that they have to take. And I want to pass this on to Dr. Flores because it's her class that's cross-listed that's currently our service learning course so she'd be the one to talk to. I'm glad she's here.
Thank you very much. So what I teach, I'm teaching a course on international migration, which serves as one of the service learning courses for the minor, the mouse minor. And what I do is like, the idea is for the students to be able to not just learn from the classroom you're being telling them all this and that, or from the books, but to experience what they're learning. So they're gonna be, for example, in my class they learn about immigration, and we're telling them, well, we know there is this myth that immigrants are considered, to come and become, criminals who maybe be dangerous. But that's not really the case. And then if you just tell them in the classroom that, but if they go into the community, and what I do is I connect them with organizations, local organizations that are working with immigrants, or they can go and teach them English, or English as a second language, and help them tutor them, or help them gain their citizenship, pass their citizenship exam and things like that. And so then the students start to say, oh, well, wait a minute, I've been interacting with these immigrants, and they're not what I hear about, and so that's the whole purpose of the service learning.
Yeah, it's not so much as volunteering, but actually learning from that experience. And one of the ideas that I have, and I need to develop the class for the Mouse Minor, because Dr. Flores has fortunately been able to do that for us, but we need to have more variety. But one of the things what I did as an undergrad was, visit, again, because I'm a homer, I guess, it's visit El Paso, and you connect the students with the different entities and agencies that are involved with, for example, immigration, right? So you would, meet with the Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection and talk with them. But you also meet with the Annunciation House, which is an immigrant, safety house organization that helps them, facilitate into the United States or what have you, a number of other services. And they can actually live on campus there. They can actually stay there. So it's not just, and of course they're contributing and they're volunteering, but the whole purpose is that they're not just coming in and coming out, right? And even though it's just for a few days, but the fact that they're living, sleeping, and eating with these groups allows them to learn, like the intricacies, right? As Dr. Flores had mentioned. Yes, Nate?
Yeah, and so in the class, they're supposed to write reflection.
Yes.
So ask them to write like a pre-reflection before they take the course, and then they receptions about immigration, and then they have something in the middle, and then at the end there's like a presentation of their experiences, what they learn and what they gain from their experiences, including the material from the class, the service learning experience, and everything put together. And so you make them reflect on their learning experience.
Yes, excellent. I'm glad you said that. Yes, Sarah.
Thank you so much for your presentations, and it's good to be here hearing ideas about
Yes.
Since Miguel knows, I'm Sarah again, your time in Spanish, classical and modern languages. And I just have a comment, and maybe this is just a beginning of further ideas for the ethnic studies, for the MALAS program, for the institute itself, because I think we have realized that sometimes we work in isolation, and we have big plans and big ideas, but if we don't share them, if we don't join efforts, sometimes those ideas don't come to fruition. And one thing I was thinking as you both were talking about connecting students to their cultural roots or histories, or also being part of the community where they belong, do you have any plans for maybe reviving the old programs we used to have, the study abroad programs to Mexico, for example, that has been dormant for a while now, but we at CMLF, and I think on behalf of my colleagues, still will be happy to work with the Malas program, with ethnic studies, with the institute itself, to revamp these other types of efforts, because I think that's in my experience taking students abroad, and I've done it for about, I don't know, so many years now. Maybe in the spring it's going to be my 7th time leading students to Seville. But my experience is that some of the students that go with us, and we don't have to go to Seville to do this, is that many of our students are from little towns in Texas that have never, ever
Left Texas.
even took up a plane. That it was their first time even jumping on a plane, let alone
A passport,
and it was such an eye-opening for them to experience a culture that they consider so much foreign, even though Spanish is also spoken in Spain, but it's a different culture. But somehow they find ways to relate to that culture and understand it, and coming back with them very open-minded. So I would be happy to consider this being about this, if that's
Most definitely. I completely agree with you. I mean, I think studying abroad, I mean, it impacted me in relation to my trajectory through the MAS program when I had. I studied in Michoacan, in Morelia, and for that experience, it would have never led me to Stanford. It would have never led me to where I'm at today. And so I completely agree with you. I think revamping, especially looking at places like Mexico, right, where the majority of our students are of Mexican descent, and they may have some interest of, either visiting anywhere in Mexico, really. We have the campus in Costa Rica that can also serve as no, I certainly agree with you. I don't know if Dr. Sanchez wants to add any more to that, but I definitely agree that study abroad should be, and that's one of the other overlapping projects or interests that whether it's Latin American studies or Mexican American studies would have, right? I mean, it's that study abroad experience, most definitely.
Yeah, I'm pretty new here, so don't know institutionally.
It's his first year here.
But yeah, I would definitely agree that study abroad seems like a perfect fit.
Yeah, I would say that even the students that are Hispanic, and what happens is that a lot of times they are raised here in the United States, and they know their parents and where they come from. Maybe they haven't had the chance to experience another country where their parents come. And like in the case of the learning class that I'm teaching, the students, they come from a class and they're Hispanic and they already know their parents are immigrants and everything. But then when they're taking the class, they understand a lot of things that, what their parents have experienced or the sacrifices they have done to raise them here in the United States, to immigrate. And so, yeah, I think there's study abroad.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, excellent idea.
That I've been at Texas Tech as a student more than 20 years ago now, when Latin American and Iberian Studies was I would say, one of the only programs like this. If you could talk about the importance and value that we have now with like Mexican American and Latino Studies program, just how that has evolved and what we have now that benefits.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think obviously, when and I was kind of tasked to lead the Mexican American Studies Working Group with Dr. Flores and several other colleagues. One thing we acknowledge is that we weren't the first ones to try. We had a few colleagues who had been here a little bit longer than I have that had talked to us about other faculty have been trying since at least the 80s to bring, because if we think about it, Texas Tech is really behind the curve when it comes to these types of programs. I mean, the University of Texas celebrated their 50th anniversary last year, the year before. They now evolved into a department. A&M, they just started their center, Mexican American. Well, they had to be different than Texas, so it's Latina, Latino, and Mexican American Studies. Well, Texas is the other way around. But they had gone straight into a center, and they have hired faculty already there. So and I met with one of the faculty members there, and he said what they had is institutional support, and I think that's something that's going to be that's the bottom line, is having university support. And what I mean by that is not verbal. We've got plenty of verbal support. What we need money. We need the actual backing, because we're well behind the curve in doing that. And again, it goes back to, studies have shown this. We've seen this in other universities. These programs, whether it's Latin American studies or Mexican American studies or Latino studies, they do help in our retention of our students. And that's one of our biggest problems, or one of our biggest challenges, I should say, is retention, because students leave for a number of reasons. But one of the biggest reasons they leave is for cost, right? It's costly for them. There's also life issues that prevent them from staying. But if we can have more programs like ethnic studies or MAS programs, then their chances of them staying here or feeling like they have a chance to stay here, it increases, right? So I think that's a long time coming. It is a long time coming, and we're still going, right? So I don't know. I'm hopeful. We're hopeful, and we'll just see where the university is at that point. But we're working. There's a lot of us. We have a pretty good, solid group that's committed to get this off the ground.
Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask. You mentioned retention, and I was wondering if y'all had any idea of how many students were involved in Mentor Tech. I used to volunteer with them, so I'm a fan, but I didn't know if something like that might help.
Mentor Tech helps, but I don't know if somebody else can speak to that. I mean, I volunteer with Mentor Tech, but it's been a few years, and I don't know what the numbers are right now.
I don't want to pretend I know what's. Yeah, that's a good point.
Just when you mentioned it, maybe.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I think it goes back to how well you mentor as a mentor.
Yeah.
And how you interact with that protege, and if the proteges are responsive.
Yeah.
Because that makes a big difference. If they're like, if you're trying, and they're just like, I just got in here because my friend is in there. I don't want to talk to this old lady who pretends she's cool. So I think it's a two-way street when it comes to like Mentor Tech or even student organizations. I know I'm having a hard time with the one that I advise. Since COVID happened, everything is, and that's with a lot of student organizations. They kind of implode because of the situations. They don't, everybody's disconnected. And I sometimes even say that about our own faculty. Sometimes we're disconnected, and that's where that communication is lost, especially among the Hispanic Latinx faculty. We're not talking to each other, and because I know, I talk to lots of different people, and they all have the same idea, same passion, but we're not talking to each other and making these things happen, regardless of the money, regardless of we should just do it, is what I say, but. We do need money too.
Yeah, we do.
Is there any other questions or comments? Well, let's thank Dr.
Thank you.
Levario.
No, thank you all. I appreciate you coming. Thank you.